Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 570, Expertise Blinders. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am actually quite happy. I had a really good day today, which is awesome because last week was just a giant pit of despair, a morass of ennui. It was all the big words at once. And this week is so much better, ever so much better. So, yay for the week, except for technology. Technology, the last 2 days for everybody, it was like somebody broke the internet and it was killing all of us. So that part wasn't great. But aside from that, something's got to be having trouble. And this time it wasn't me. Yay. I hope your week has been well, been going well as well. I have a very interesting voicemail to play for you from Anita, who has called in before. She's the Well Knit Life on Ravelry, and I'm just going to play her voicemail for you because it made me think about a lot of things as well. So we'll talk on the flip side. Here we go.
Hi, Heather. This is Anita, also known as Well Knit Life. And I wanted to first of all thank you for this really fun book. I think it is great. I'm enjoying it so far, and I hope everybody who can gets a shot soon. I'm really looking forward to when the last member of my family will be eligible to get a COVID vaccine because he is less than 12 years old, so he is not eligible yet. The final thing I wanted to bring up is that about a year ago you had posted about having heard or watched this YouTube video from the woman who is Kathy Hay, who is making the peacock dress or remaking the peacock dress. I had never heard of that dress before, but she was talking about, her digging a little bit deeper into the history of the dress and finding out all the layers of how it was made and the types of labor that was used in India to make the dress, etc. And after that, I hadn't personally listened that much to or followed along with what was going on, but I did have something cross my path, which was a video put on by a fellow Indian American woman who is involved in the costuming area, named Nami Sparrow. That's her, the name that she, I guess, is on social media under. And I thought she had some good points to the dialogue. I think probably the biggest one of which is that, of all the beautiful period dresses from that time period you could make, maybe this one isn't the best choice just because it was created specifically for the event of really just underlining and celebrating the fact that India was under colonial rule by the British. And having watched the video, I agree with a lot of the points. It's been something I've actually been kind of thinking a lot about in the last couple of days since I saw her video, and I thought it's something that adds to the conversation. And it really kind of represents, I think, a lot of times we have our ideas about what we're doing, and we don't think about the other option that was on the table, which is it's not just I'm going to make this dress and I'm going to contextualize it, but maybe another option would be also I'm going to make a similar period dress that maybe doesn't have this specific baggage, because I can confirm as someone who one of my other hats was getting my undergraduate degree in history, specifically South Asian history, that there was a lot of ugly stuff involved with the colonial rule by the British in India. So sometimes we just get very focused on, well, there's this thing we want to do, and let's see how we can do it in the best way possible, and taking in information from other people. But there's also sometimes the option of letting go and not getting so invested in our sunk costs, the things that we've already done to work towards this goal, think about those as things that can inform our next project, and perhaps something that has this particular history wouldn't be the best choice. And it just, on a side note, you don't have to include this, but it's kind of occurring to me that part of my anxiety about calling is this feeling like I need to be an expert even beyond like I said, my personal expertise. I'm like a doctor, and I'm someone who has spent a lot of time studying Indian history, and I still am feeling like, oh gosh, I need to have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed and everything completely figured out before I speak up, and maybe that isn't always right. Maybe sometimes it's important for everybody to speak up sometimes.
So first off, yay! I am so glad you are enjoying this book. I am too. I am hearing good things from lots of people, so fantastic. And once again, thank you, Mom, who has now pointed out that Nancy Drew, the originals, not with Ned, Nancy Drew is about to go public domain very shortly. Actually, Hardy Boys, I think, are going to public domain first, and then Nancy Drew. So, we have a little Nancy Drew exploration, contextual and otherwise, because she changed quite a bit. There were the early Nancy Drew books, and then many of them were revised in the 50s, which is the Nancy Drew that I remembered most clearly, but she was not the original Nancy Drew. So, who knows what might be in our future at some point, making plans far, far out into the future. Because why not? It's not like we're running out of books, right? I mean, the translation thing is still hard for doing books that weren't written in English, but aside from that. Anyway, so glad, Anita, that you are enjoying the book. Second, holy cow, yes, vaccines for kids, please. My sister in Berlin is just up a creek, and the sooner we can get vaccines into children, the faster, the better. The last time I heard anybody who knew anything that they were talking about it, they were hoping that by the end of October. I have not heard a peep. I have to go back and listen to the full panel of my geeky virologists to see if any of them have any news. But my fingers are crossed, but I worry that it's going to take longer. And all of us on the contact tracing side, it's quite a strange position to be in, because the reason that you have gainful employment is because of a pandemic, and none of us want the pandemic to go on. We all want to have a job, but truly there are conversations going all the time that start out by saying, God, I just hope this thing ends sooner. I wish everybody would just listen to us and stay home and make it end. And then there's this pause when you kind of go, which actually leads me into the other thing that Anita was talking about with Kathy Hay and the peacock dress, and the idea that perhaps this is something that we should just let go, or maybe rebuild it in a new way that says something different instead of the subjugation of another country as you colonize it. Find some way to turn that paradigm on its ear and come up with something new, something now, and something better. I loved the way you said it, though, Anita, because the thing that made you so craftlit, I like to think the thing that made you so craftlit in the way you said it was that you weren't insulting or talking down to or anything. It was like, I get it. The dress is really beautiful. It really, really is. But it also has all this baggage. And that's where the title of this episode came from. The expertise blinders that all of us wind up suffering under at some point, that we are so good at a thing And all of us get to the point as we get older and we practice more things. We all get to a point where we have become some level of expert in a craft, a habit, a job, an area of study. There's always that moment where you kind of, oh, wow, I actually know I understand what I'm hearing. This is kind of cool. Or I understand what I'm watching. This is really neat. There's the flip side to it, which I think we talked about way back on Frankenstein. I'm pretty sure we talked about it, Frankenstein, which is the just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. And I don't think I ever talked about this while I was working at the company with the scientists, but there were several scientists who I really loved. I loved working with them. I loved working in the same building with them. I loved getting a chance to talk to them. They were just lovely, wonderful people. So that's a given. You know, if I'm going to spend a lot of time with someone, I am not going to make that time investment on somebody who makes me unhappy or miserable to be around. So yeah, wonderful people. The company was working on therapeutics for and one day we hope a cure for a particular range of genetically based diseases and specifically ones that kill children. So the fire under everybody's tuchus was definitely there. They want to succeed. Every once in a while, there would be a discussion about some pathway, some experimental pathway to eventually, not something that they were going to do right then, but like, ooh, well, if we get this done and this done and that done and this done, then at that point we could do this. And I remember a couple of times where I must have had some kind of expression on my face because we wound up having the conversation. Well, yeah, but that's kind of letting a genie out of the bottle, right? I mean, if you got to that point and you did that, you can't put that away. That's going to be a thing. And while I have perfect faith that you, person who I'm talking to, would make good, smart, ethical decisions about the ability that you now have, the power that you now have because you've figured out all these other steps, I don't necessarily have that much faith in other people. And that makes me very nervous. And I remember two specific occasions where the scientists looked at me like I had just walked off the surface of the sun. Like this had never crossed their mind as a question. And I thought, huh, I was kind of sure that that question got asked slash communicated as a thought process in school, medical school, science school, biomedical school. I guess I don't know why I thought that would have been discussed or communicated, probably just because I was living around the theater people and the English majors. And so, of course, that was a huge topic of discussion for us because that's where art finds so much to talk about and perform about and try and get people to think about more. So if you don't live in my world, it actually does make sense that those questions wouldn't necessarily have ever been asked of you, which is another reason why it's really good to talk to people who don't do your job. You get to have all these different perspectives and it's really cool and exciting. And I do see the expertise blinders more and more often, and maybe it's because we get more and more polarized, but I actually think this is something different because I even saw Dr. Fauci do it. And he's usually really good at communicating with people. But my guess is that he was actually kind of nervous when this happened. But he was asked a pointed question. It was not a fair question. It was very much like, so, Mr. Smith, when did you stop beating your wife? Which we've talked about before, is not a question that you can answer with impunity. There's no good way out of that particular logical fallacy that was flung at you. He was asked a question along those lines, and he was clearly very frustrated. And I'm sure the man does not get any sleep anyway. But he resorted to using clinical language, which was not an effective means of communicating what needed to be said. It's just like Oh, the book that came out called Premonition about COVID and how this all happened. And if you haven't read it, holy cow, listen to it. It's a marvelous listen. You can do it in chunks because it's not fiction. It's not like it's a people narrative, although it is a narrative. It's telling the story of how this all happened. And it's not blamey at all. It's just revelatory. There are like moments where you say, "Oh, that's what those people's jobs are." Huh. All right. Well, that explains why they didn't do what I thought they were supposed to do. So now I know. But the story that this all brought to mind was why did the WHO originally not come out and say, "Hey, folks, early March 2020, y'all need to wear masks. Put a barrier up. Stop breathing and coughing on each other. Just like with the cold or the flu, if you put a barrier up, you will prevent other people from getting sick and you will prevent yourself from getting sick as well." A little bit of the latter, a lot of the former. All good things. Why did they not come out and say that? And the answer is this: we know people won't follow instructions. I agree with them. We know people won't follow instructions, and therefore they will be touching the mask all the time and scratching their face through the mask or not wearing the mask properly. And so it's a useless ask. That was, to me, a moment of expertise blinders. It's like they are experts. They understand how, in a perfect world, these things should work. But as we say, we don't live in the land of should. Any barrier would have been better than no barrier at all at that point. And I hear those kinds of things happening so often where it's not that somebody is lying to you. It's not that somebody is saying an untruth or trying to say an untruth or trying to, hedge their bets and get around it. It's that they're speaking in the language that is the language that their world functions in. I am not a member of that world. I don't have that language on hand. I need somebody to provide me with a metaphor. I need some way in so that I can understand the point that they're trying to make. And if nobody finds that metaphor, if nobody gives me a way to come in, then I feel excluded. And nobody wants to feel excluded. And then I get fniffy like anybody else. The thing that I thought was so interesting about the way Anita was talking about the peacock dress is I could see exactly what she was saying. And yeah, I get it. But it was her follow-up statement that gave me the metaphor, not even the metaphor, that gave me the here's how I'm going to say it for the muggles in the room moment where I went, oh, okay. Yeah, there's got to be some other dress, some other way to approach recreating historical dresses that doesn't dredge up all of the violence and the subjugation and the better than attitude that just came layered with every bead on that original dress. And I thought, well, that's what we need more of. Whether it's suffragettes trying to explain why it's so important for women to get the vote, or it's women in Texas right now trying to say, it's nice that y'all say my body, my choice when it comes to a mask. But then you turn around and tell me I can't control whether or not I bring a child to term, regardless of circumstance. Or whether it's a kid in class saying after class, I'm sorry, you misunderstood me. I wasn't talking back. I was trying to help you out because you put the wrong page number on the board and people were going to be confused about their homework. Finding the way to say it in a way that doesn't offend, finding a way to say it in a way that can be heard, that isn't blamey or judgy or angry, but is instead inclusive and reminding us that there are other perspectives. There's more than one way to see the same thing. Just like, oh, I heard this wonderful story about an artist. You know how when people do studio art classes, there's the ones that are the human body classes. But then there are also, you come into class and there's a still life. And so it's a cow skull and a pear and a single orchid. And they're all just on the table, arranged dramatically and artistically. And you pull up an easel and a stool, and you sit down and you draw from the perspective that you are viewing the thing at. And the woman who was telling the story said that she and her friend were always arriving late to class because they had to come all the way across campus. So the only spaces that were left in the class when they got there were the lousy views. And she struggled every week with this lousy view and trying to make something of that point of view that she had to look at. Her friend is in an equally lousy point of view, but instead of recreating exactly what she was seeing, she was able to, and I don't know how she did this, change her own perspective without moving her body. So if, for example, the cow skull was off of the table just a little bit, and maybe the orchid was leaning over the edge of the table as well, she would draw as though she were lying on the floor looking up. So it would just be the edge of the table, the chunk of the cow skull that she could have seen if she was actually under the table herself, and the piece of orchid that would be showing. And I thought, oh, that's amazing. I can't do that. I wish I could do that. But that idea of being able to get into a different position and think about something a totally different way, I love it. I love it. And I wish it were easier for people not to feel hurt or attacked by people having different viewpoints. I mean, I get it. I know why it happens. But it's sad. And I hope we find a way to get better at hearing as much as we are oh so very good at talking, she said, for looking at the clock and realizing how long she's talked for. Anyway, we have a Mr. Grice chapter. I am so excited. I'm so excited to be bringing you a Mr. Grice chapter. And I have some interesting words for you. Well, one's a phrase, two are words. It doesn't happen very often in a book like this where there's language that is, odd or particularly out of date or odd. But there are a couple. The first one is just a word that isn't used particularly often, which is impecunious, which means you have no money, you are penniless. You really wish you had money, but you didn't or don't. The earliest, she said, looking at the OED, the earliest known usage of the word impecunious, which comes from French, was 1596. So that's kind of cool. Then there is a phrase, and the phrase is, "Hail, fellow, well met." So the OED is kind of interesting about it. This one also goes well into the 1500s. So 1577 looks like the first usage of "Hail, fellow, well met." It actually comes from the Hollandset Chronicles, history of Ireland, or the portion of the Chronicles that deals with the history of Ireland. So "Hail, fellow, well met" lives in the OED, and this is the first time that I've seen this happen. This entry, this is a quote from the page, "This entry has not yet been fully updated. This entry was first published in 1898, and the most recently modified version was published online in September 2019. It gives the etymology of a now obsolete or archaic "hail fellow" greeting, but then goes on to say that as an adjectival phrase, "hail fellow well met," it's a indication that either the person who you're saying it to is someone who you are very close to, that there's a level of simpatico that's going on between you and this other person. You don't just say, "Hail fellow well met," to be cute or funny with somebody you just got to know last week. This is indicating that there is some amount of intimacy, not necessarily sexual intimacy, but intimacy of a relationship, that there's there's been a history, a good one, between you two. It can also therefore be used in the other extreme, that it's forced, like somebody is being way too familiar with you. When students used to use my first name, it really threw me. I didn't think I was going to be that person, but I really was. It just threw me for a loop. It felt like a line had been crossed that was uncomfortable. So I just thought it was interesting. And you know me, I find this interesting stuff. Who else do I have to share it with? You guys. And, Tuesday morning and Thursday night Zooms. So there it is. You get to enjoy it too. I also thought that it's not just a cheery way to greet somebody, that there is actually this undertone of more than casual connection to the person who you're talking to. The last word that I wanted to talk to you about tonight before we get into our chapter is one that I am never, ever, ever able to get right until now. And I am so excited because now that I have an OED, I was finally able to find the entry that made it all make sense to me. I hope it does for you as well. And it is this: nonplussed. Every time I come across it, I have to look the bloody thing up. I cannot, for the life of me, remember what it means. As a noun, it means it's a state in which no more can be said or done. There is no ability to proceed in speech or action. And then further down, it says a state of perplexity or puzzlement, being at a standstill. So it's when you're so dropped by something that somebody else said, like, I cannot believe you just did that, said that, wore that, something like that, that there is nowhere to go from here. Just mic drop, we're done. Now I found the reference that makes it all make sense. And that is because it comes from classical Latin, meaning not more or no further. There is nowhere to go from here, literally. I get it now. I get it now. So when you hear in the chapter today that someone is nonplussed, they are thrown for a loop. There is nowhere to go. They are just standing there going blah, 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 because they have no idea what to say. You're welcome. I have no idea if that word has bugged you as much as it's bugged me for most of my adult life, but if it has, you're welcome. All right, on that note, we are now going to listen to Mr. Gryce at Home, and I'll talk to you more on the flip side. Here we go.
Book 2, Henry Clavering. Chapter 14, Mr. Gryce at Home. Nay, but hear me. Measure for measure. That the guilty person for whom Eleanor Leavenworth stood ready to sacrifice herself was one for whom she had formerly cherished affection, I could no longer doubt. Love, or the strong sense of duty growing out of love, being alone sufficient to account for such determined action. Obnoxious as it was to all my prejudices, one name alone, that of the commonplace secretary, with his sudden heats and changeful manners, his odd ways and studied self-possession, would recur to my mind whenever I asked myself who this person could be. Not that, without the light which had been thrown upon the affair by Eleanor's strange behaviour, I should have selected this man as one in any way open to suspicion, the peculiarity of his manner at the inquest not being marked enough to counteract the improbability of one in his relations to the deceased finding sufficient motive for a crime so manifestly without favourable results to himself. But if love had entered as a factor into the affair, what might not be expected? James Harwell, simple amanuensis to a retired tea merchant, was one man. James Harwell, swayed by passion for a woman beautiful as Eleanor Leavenworth, was another. And in placing him upon the list of those parties open to suspicion, I felt I was only doing what was warranted by a proper consideration of probabilities. But Between casual suspicion and actual proof, what a gulf! To believe James Harwell capable of guilt, and to find evidence enough to accuse him of it, were two very different things. I felt myself instinctively shrink from the task, before I had fully made up my mind to attempt it. Some relenting thought of his unhappy position, if innocent, forcing itself upon me, and making my very distrust of him seem personally ungenerous, if not absolutely unjust. If I had liked the man better, I should not have been so ready to look upon him with doubt. But Eleanor must be saved at all hazards. Once delivered up to the blight of suspicion, who could tell what the result might be? The arrest of her person, perhaps, a thing which, once accomplished, would cast a shadow over her young life that it would take more than time to dispel. The accusation of an impecunious secretary would be less horrible than this. I determined to make an early call upon Mr. Gryce. Meanwhile, the contrasted pictures of Eleanor standing with her hand upon the breast of the dead, her face upraised and mirroring a glory I could not recall without emotion, and Mary fleeing a short half-hour later indignantly from her presence, haunted me and kept me awake long after midnight. It was like a double vision of light and darkness, that, while contrasting, neither assimilated nor harmonized. I could not flee from it. Do what I would, the two pictures followed me, filling my soul with alternate hope and distrust, till I knew not whether to place my hand with Eleanor on the breast of the dead, and swear implicit faith in her truth and purity, or to turn my face like Mary, and fly from what I could neither comprehend nor reconcile. Expectant of difficulty, I started next morning upon my search for Mr. Gryce, with strong determination not to allow myself to become flurried by disappointment, nor discouraged by premature failure. My business was to save Eleanor Leavenworth, and to do that it was necessary for me to preserve not only my equanimity but my self-possession. The worst fear I anticipated was that matters would reach a crisis before I could acquire the right or obtain the opportunity to interfere. However, the fact of Mr. Leavenworth's funeral being announced for that day gave me some comfort in that direction, my knowledge of Mr. Gryce being sufficient, as I thought, to warrant me in believing he would wait until after that ceremony before proceeding to extreme measures. I do not know that I had any very definite ideas of what a detective's home should be, but when I stood before the neat 3-story brick house to which I had been directed, I could not but acknowledge there was something in the aspect of its half-open shutters, over closely drawn curtains of spotless purity, highly suggestive of the character of its inmate. A pale-looking youth, with vivid locks of red hair hanging straight down over either ear, answered my rather nervous ring. To my inquiry as to whether Mr. Gryce was in, he gave a kind of snort, which might have meant no, but which I took to mean yes. "My name is Raymond, and I wish to see him." He gave me one glance that took in every detail of my person and apparel, and pointed to a door at the head of the stairs. Not waiting for further directions, I hastened up, knocked at the door he had designated, and went in. The broad back of Mr. Gryce, stooping above a desk that might have come over in the Mayflower, confronted me. "Well," he exclaimed, "this is an honour." And rising, he opened with a squeak and shut with a bang the door of an enormous stove that occupied the centre of the room. "Rather chilly day, eh?" "Yes," I returned, eyeing him closely to see if he was in a communicative mood. "But I have had but little time to consider the state of the weather. My anxiety in regard to this murder—" "To be sure," he interrupted, fixing his eyes upon the poker, though not with any hostile intention, I am sure. "A puzzling piece of business enough, but perhaps it is an open book to you. I see you have something to communicate." "I have, though I doubt it is of the nature you expect, Mr. Gryce. Since I saw you last, my convictions upon a certain point have been strengthened into an absolute belief. The object of your suspicions is an innocent woman." If I had expected him to betray any surprise at this, I was destined to be disappointed. "That is a very pleasing belief," he observed. "I honor you for entertaining it, Mr. Raymond." I suppressed a movement of anger. "So thoroughly is it mine," I went on, in the determination to arouse him in some way, "that I have come here to day to ask you, in the name of justice and common humanity, to suspend action in that direction till we can convince ourselves there is no truer scent to go upon." But there was no more show of curiosity than before. "Indeed," he cried, "that is a singular request to come from a man like you." I was not to be discomposed. "Mr. Gryce," I went on, "a woman's name, once tarnished, remains so forever. Eleanor Leavenworth has too many noble traits to be thoughtlessly dealt with in so momentous a crisis. If you will give me your attention, I promise you shall not regret it." He smiled, and allowed his eyes to roam from the poker to the arm of my chair. "Very well," he remarked. "I hear you. Say on." I drew my notes from my pocket book and laid them on the table. "What! Memoranda!" he exclaimed. "Unsafe, very. Never put your plans on paper." Taking no heed of the interruption, I went on. "Mr. Gryce, I have had fuller opportunities than yourself for studying this woman. I have seen her in a position which no guilty person could occupy, and I am assured, beyond all doubt, that not only her hands but her heart are pure from this crime. She may have some knowledge of its secrets, that I do not presume to deny. The key, seen in her possession, would refute me if I did. But what if she has? You can never wish to see so lovely a being brought to shame for withholding information which she evidently considers it her duty to keep back, when, by a little patient finesse, we may succeed in our purposes without it." "But," interposed the detective, "say this is so, how are we to arrive at the knowledge we want without following out the only clue which has yet been given us?" "You will never reach it by following out any clues given you by Eleanor Leavenworth." His eyebrows lifted expressively, but he said nothing. "Miss Eleanor Leavenworth has been used by some one acquainted with her firmness, generosity, and perhaps love. Let us discover who possesses sufficient power over her to control her to this extent, and we find the man we seek." Came from Mr. Gryce's compressed lips, and no more. Determined that he should speak, I waited. "You have then some one in your mind?" he remarked at last, almost flippantly. "I mentioned no names," I returned. "All I want is further time." "You are, then, intending to make a personal business of this matter?" "I am." He gave a long, low whistle. "May I ask," he inquired at length, "whether you expect to work entirely by yourself, or whether, if a suitable coadjutor were provided, you would disdain his assistance and slight his advice?" "I desire nothing more than to have you for my colleague." The smile upon his face deepened ironically. "You must feel very sure of yourself," said he. "I am very sure of Miss Leavenworth." The reply seemed to please him. "Let us hear what you propose doing." I did not immediately answer. The truth was, I had formed no plans. "It seems to me," he continued, "that you have undertaken a rather difficult task for an amateur. Better leave it to me, Mr. Raymond. Better leave it to me." "I am sure," I returned, "that nothing would please me better. Not," he interrupted, "but that a word from you now and then would be welcome. I am not an egotist. I am open to suggestions, as, for instance, now. If you would conveniently inform me of all you have yourself seen and heard in regard to this matter, I should be most happy to listen." Relieved to find him so amenable, I asked myself what I really had to tell, not so much that he would consider vital. However, it would not do to hesitate now. "Mr. Gryce," said I have but few facts to add to those already known to you. Indeed, I am more moved by conviction than facts. That Eleanor Leavenworth never committed this crime, I am assured. That, on the other hand, the real perpetrator is known to her, I am equally certain, and that for some reason she considers it a sacred duty to shield the assassin, even at the risk of her own safety, follows as a matter of course from the facts. Now, with such data, it cannot be a very difficult task for you or me to work out satisfactorily, to our own minds at least, who this person can be. A little more knowledge of the family. You know nothing of its secret history, then? Nothing. Do not even know whether either of these girls is engaged to be married? I do not, I returned, wincing at this direct expression of my own thoughts. He remained a moment silent. "Mr. Raymond," he cried at last, "have you any idea of the disadvantages under which a detective labors? For instance, now, you imagine I can insinuate myself into all sorts of society, perhaps, but you are mistaken. Strange as it may appear, I have never, by any possibility of means, succeeded with one class of persons at all. I cannot pass myself off for a gentleman. Tailors and barbers are no good. I am always found out." He looked so dejected I could scarcely forbear smiling, notwithstanding my secret care and anxiety. "I have even employed a French valet, who understood dancing and whiskers, but it was all of no avail. The first gentleman I approached stared at me. Real gentlemen, I mean, none of your American dandies. And I had no stare to return. I had forgotten that emergency in my confabs with Pierre Catneel Marie Makeface." Amused, but a little discomposed by this sudden turn in the conversation, I looked at Mr. Gryce inquiringly. "Now you, I dare say, have no trouble. Was born one, perhaps. Can even ask a lady to dance without blushing, eh?" "Well," I commenced. "Just so," he replied. "Now, I can't. I can enter a house, bow to the mistress of it, let her be as elegant as she will, so long as I have a writ of arrest in my hand, or some such professional matter upon my mind. But when it comes to visiting in kid gloves, raising a glass of champagne in response to a toast, and such like, I am absolutely good for nothing." And he plunged his two hands into his hair, and looked dolefully at the head of the cane I carried in my hand. "But it is much the same with the whole of us. When we are in want of a gentleman to work for us, we have to go outside of our profession." I began to see what he was driving at, but held my peace, vaguely conscious I was likely to prove a necessity to him after all. "Mr. Raymond," he now said, almost abruptly, "do you know a gentleman by the name of Clavering, residing at present at the Hoffman House?" "Not that I am aware of." "He is very polished in his manners. Would you mind making his acquaintance?" I followed Mr. Gryce's example and stared at the chimney-piece. "I cannot answer till I understand matters a little better," I returned at length. "There is not much to understand. Mr. Henry Clavering, a gentleman and a man of the world, resides at the Hoffman House. He is a stranger in town, without being strange. Drives, walks, smokes, but never visits. Looks at the ladies, but is never seen to bow to one. In short, a person whom it is desirable to know, but whom, being a proud man, with something of the old world prejudice against Yankee freedom and forwardness, I would no more approach in the way of acquaintance than I could the Emperor of Austria." "And you wish—" "He would make a very agreeable companion for a rising young lawyer of good family and undoubted respectability. I have no doubt if you undertook to cultivate him, you would find him well worth the trouble, but might even desire to take him into familiar relations, to confide in him, and—" "Mr. Gryce," I hastily interrupted, "I can never consent to plot for any man's friendship for the sake of betraying him to the police." "It is essential to your plans to make the acquaintance of Mr. Clavering," he dryly replied. "Oh," I returned, a light breaking in upon me, "he has some connection with this case, then?" Mr. Gryce smoothed his coat sleeve thoughtfully. "I don't know as it will be necessary for you to betray him. You wouldn't object to being introduced to him?" "No." "Nor, if you found him pleasant, to converse with him?" "No." "Not even if, in the course of conversation, you should come across something that might serve as a clue in your efforts to save Eleanore Leavenworth?" The "no" I uttered this time was less assured. The part of a spy was the very last one I desired to play in the coming drama. "Well, then," he went on, ignoring the doubtful tone in which my assent had been given, "I advise you to immediately take up your quarters at the Hoffman House." "I doubt if that would do," I said. "If I am not mistaken, I have already seen this gentleman and spoken to him." "Where?" "Describe him first." "Well, he is tall, finely formed, of very upright carriage, with a handsome dark face, brown hair streaked with gray, a piercing eye, and a smooth address. A very imposing personage, I assure you." "I have reason to think I have seen him," I returned, and in a few words told him when and where. "Hum," said he at the conclusion. "He is evidently as much interested in you as we are in him." "How's that? I think I see," he added after a moment's thought. "Pity you spoke to him. May have created an unfavorable impression, and everything depends upon your meeting without any distrust." He rose and paced the floor. "Well, we must move slowly, that is all. Give him a chance to see you in other and better lights. Drop into the Hoffman House reading room. Talk with the best men you meet while there, but not too much or too indiscriminately. Mr. Clavering is fastidious, and will not feel honored by the attentions of one who is hail fellow well met with everybody. Show yourself for what you are, and leave all advances to him. He'll make them." "Supposing we are under a mistake, and the man I met on the corner of 37th Street was not Mr. Clavering?" "I should be greatly surprised, that's all." Not knowing what further objection to make, I remained silent. "And this head of mine would have to put on its thinking cap," he pursued jovially. "Mr. Gryce," I now said, anxious to show that all this talk about an unknown party had not served to put my own plans from my mind, "there is one person of whom we have not spoken." "No?" he exclaimed softly, wheeling round until his broad back confronted me. "And who may that be?" "Why, who but Mr. I could get no further. What right had I to mention any man's name in this connection, without possessing sufficient evidence against him to make such mention justifiable? "I beg your pardon," said I, "but I think I will hold to my first impulse, and speak no names." "Harwell?" he ejaculated easily. The quick blush rising to my face gave an involuntary assent. "I see no reason why we shouldn't speak of him," he went on. That is, if there is anything to be gained by it. His testimony at the inquest was honest, you think? It has not been disproved. He's a peculiar man, and so am I." I felt myself slightly nonplussed, and, conscious of appearing at a disadvantage, lifted my hat from the table and prepared to take my leave. But, suddenly thinking of Hannah, turned and asked if there was any news of her. He seemed to debate with himself, hesitating so long that I began to doubt if this man intended to confide in me, after all, when suddenly he brought his two hands down before him and exclaimed vehemently, "The Evil One himself is in this business. If the earth had opened and swallowed up this girl, she couldn't have more effectually disappeared." I experienced a sinking of the heart. Eleanor had said Hannah can do nothing for me. Could it be that the girl was indeed gone, and forever? "I have innumerable agents at work, to say nothing of the general public, and yet not so much as a whisper has come to me in regard of her whereabouts or situation. I am only afraid we shall find her floating in the river some fine morning, without a confession in her pocket." "Everything hangs upon that girl's testimony," I remarked. He gave a short grunt. "What does Miss Leavenworth say about it?" "That the girl cannot help her." I thought he looked a trifle surprised at this, but he covered it with a nod and an exclamation. "She must be found, for all that," said he, "and shall, if I have to send out Q." "Q?" "An agent of mine, who is a living interrogation point. So we call him Q, which is short for query." Then, as I turned again to go, "When the contents of the will are made known, come to me." The will! I had forgotten the will.
All right, so we got to see a little more Grice. We got to see Mr. Raymond. What a cliffhanger at the end of that chapter, by the way. The will! I forgot about the will. And I know we didn't talk any about the previous chapters before we listened to this one. I didn't think we needed to pre-hash the rehash. Instead, I was going to say here, you are just starting to get the first hints of how complex the relationship is between Eleanor and Mary, and how complex it was between them and their uncle, Leavenworth, who sadly passed away, giving us a reason to have a book. Their relationship is very complicated, and just like we were saying before, with people making assumptions and not listening and understanding, a lot of assumptions have been made about Hannah and about Mary and her reasons for her behavior, and Eleanor. There are also some assumptions that Mr. Raymond, our lawyer narrator, has made about Grice, I think. And I think there's been a little two-way street on that assumptions being made thing. I love that Mr. Grice is pulling Mr. Raymond in because he can't pass for a gentleman. That was the moment when I said, it's not going to matter that this book is supposed to be taking place in New York City, and our reader has a lovely accent. Because at that moment, I thought, okay, you know what? All of the accents that he puts on, whether he's being the Irish butler, or he's being one of the ladies, or he's being Harwell, doesn't matter. Because Grice is talking about a very specifically classed world that he's living in. And the accents that Kevin Green uses, I think, do a marvelous job of communicating that same kind of leveled, not leveled as in flat, but leveled as in multi-leveled societal situation. I think it does a beautiful job. That was the moment where I was like, okay, I think this is going to work out fine. We're happy. And so now we, next week, I think it's next week, we get to see Mr. Raymond head out to find Henry Clavering, see if he can go meet up with him at one of the gentlemen's clubs, of which New York had many at the time. And then there was the one little hint dropped about Q, the agent of mine who is a living interrogation point. He is a living question mark. And so they call him Q. I love that. Short for query. Ha! Q shows up in other Mr. Gryce books. I think there are 12 books, 12 or 14, I think, that Anna Catherine Green wrote that have Gryce in them. And then her female detective, who is kind of the prototype for Miss Marple, also shows up with Mr. Gryce in several of those books, which is a lot of fun. That is it. I hope you are well. I hope you stay well. I hope you have very good weeks. And I'll talk to you soon. Be good. Take care of each other. Wear a mask. Get a vaccine if you can. I'll talk to you next week. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.